And with us now to talk about regional food co-op trends and the challenges they face, our guest is Arne Kildegard. Arne is from the Pomme de Terre Co-op in Morris. Arne, thanks for joining us on Compass.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Les.
So, food co-ops have been around for a long time, and of course, before we started this discussion, we were just sitting around. We talked about the fact that we've heard about food co-ops in the Twin Cities, and they've been around in the 60s and 70s. But now we're seeing more of them in small towns. So what's your experience with food co-op in Morris?
Well, so I moved to the region in 2001, and you notice right away that it's not, in terms of fine dining alternatives, it's not exactly a food mecca, and sort of surprisingly, it wasn't really very easy to get a hold of locally grown foods. I mean, here we are, we're surrounded by some of the best agricultural land in the country, and yet the vegetables you see in your standard grocery store are imported from Chile or something like that. And some of the people I met right away were foodies, and I wasn't really initially part of that orbit, but I came to appreciate sort of the connection to the source of your own food and what that means in terms of how it's produced, how humanely it's produced, and above all, the thing that trumps all other considerations is how much better it tastes. So I got connected to that right away through the local co-op, the Pomme de Terre Food Co-op in Morris, which was started back in the 70s in somebody's broom closet, and it's been going out of business for some 40 years now.
Well, it's interesting because some communities food co-ops make it, and other communities they don't, and some they make it for a little while and they get the money and it seems to be working, and then it falls apart. And others, like in the Morris case, survive for a long time. But it sounds like there's not necessarily a lot of assurance that they will survive.
Well, it's a tough market. The grocery business generally operates on very thin margins, and there's stiff competition. What makes it possible to drive prices down is, first of all, mass production on the agriculture side, and second of all, high volume at the retail side. And the co-ops, that's not really the niche they occupy for the most part. Often they're doing relatively low turnover per square foot of shelf space or something like that, and they're sourcing some of their materials from local producers who are not doing everything in their power to confine as many animals in as small a space as possible.
Yeah, so it's a niche market, clearly, and like a lot of cooperatives that have started up in the history of cooperatives, isn't this largely about organizations that started to meet a need that the rest of the marketplace wasn't meeting?
I think that's right. I think that the sort of original philosophy behind cooperatives was to organize the need, and it's hard to make one go in a community where the need is already being serviced by the private market somehow. But it continues to have a role in both, particularly in this niche of connecting people to where their food comes from, to connecting farmers to consumers, and helping people sort of understand, what that means for the quality of the water and the quality of the soil and the quality of the air, and above all, the quality of the food.
And also part of, I would figure, the larger food culture, which is to say people having a greater interest in flavor. Because if a food transfers a shorter distance, and this isn't necessarily criticism of large grocery, but the idea is, if that tomato comes out of a local farmer's field or a tomato comes out of my garden, there's a taste difference between that and one that's traveled from California.
No, it's really true. It's really true. When I was a kid, the one food I could not choke down was an egg. I can remember that, pit in my stomach when I'd come down to breakfast and Mom would have eggs on the table, and in my family it wasn't really permissible to not like something, right?
Sure.
So
I had to eat what was there.
That was what it was, and then I was visiting a friend in Austin, Wisconsin, and they sent me out to pick up the eggs out of the hen house, and it was just like the light bulbs went on. The sun emerged from behind the clouds. It was a completely different food. And I still feel that way about sort of your mass-produced eggs versus the locally raised chickens and eggs that we have at our food co-op. So that's one pristine example of how that works.
And it's also a common theme, I think, among so many of the rural people that you and I know, that they grew up with, their own eggs, own meat, food out of their garden. So in some way, it's sort of a return to rural roots for a number of them, because that flavor, that memory is very important to them.
Yeah.
And as such, they're often willing to pay more to have it through a cooperative or a local food distributor.
Yeah. It's largely about the flavor. There's just an enormous difference in what a chicken tastes like that's been running around in somebody's yard versus one that was raised by, I don't want to pick on the mass producers, but it's an enormous difference in taste. And then, over time I've come to feel like, the life of that chicken probably matters too. And the time it had on earth scratching a worm out of the dirt, that's not such a bad thing if a chicken can do that.
Well, and I think that for a lot of people in the food movement, it's been flavor driven. There are other reasons, but again, if that's a particular need, or they say, well, I like this type of a flavor. It may be heritage turkeys. It may be a particular variety of tomato, and those may be things that are less, they're more difficult to find in a traditional market. And that's what you've got in co-ops, I expect, is a lot of those things.
That's what we're trying to do, and it's not an easy problem to get food from the farm to the grocer, get it sold before it goes bad. Produce is notoriously difficult for people who are professional grocers, and a lot of co-ops are not really professionals in that way. So it's a hard problem. I don't want to undersell that, but I feel like it's worthwhile. And one of the things we do at our co-op is we have a monthly potluck. And that's a reason to bring together a bunch of people who aren't necessarily from the same backgrounds. We have somebody do a presentation, somebody from the local foods community do a presentation. Last month it was the woman from Red Head Creamery up in Bruton, I think it is, and so on and so forth. So it gives all of us gathered a chance to meet somebody who's actually on the production end. It gets the production people a chance to meet who their final consumers are, and it builds community. So I think that's an important part of the picture too.
Yeah, starting a conversation about food, starting a relationship around food, which is very much an important societal tradition, that we often gather around food and then have a discussion about where did this come from, how did you produce it, how could it be cooked, how should it be prepared, what are the other ways to do it, and so I expect that there's a large social component to it as well.
Absolutely, it's a very civilized thing.
Yeah. So what's the future of the economics of cooperatives? Because I know from time to time, there'll be these sort of blips on the screen where people say, oh, what's happening with co-ops? Are they still making it? Is it still fitting the niche? Because the grocery world has changed a ton. There's a lot more that's available in grocery stores. So what about the economics of co-ops today?
Well, it's a tough question. I think, and co-ops span everything from sort of micro co-ops, like the one that I'm most familiar with, to something like the Wedge in the Twin Cities, which does tens of millions of dollars in annual revenue.
All these are food co-ops,
food
I should
co-ops.
say. Yeah, food co-ops.
Is that what you're asking me about?
Yeah,
food
co-ops,
co-ops?
yeah.
And so in some ways, we're playing on completely different terms. The rural co-ops keep their costs reasonable by using a lot of volunteer labor, members who will staff the register or will take on some piece of the work. This person does the cheese ordering, this person does the produce ordering, and maintains the relationships with the farmers, and so on and so forth. So you can't beat zero labor costs, right? I mean, that's a competitive advantage.
If you've got volunteers on one side, the economics start to work out.
They start to work better, right. Our co-op, like a lot of co-ops, continues to stock local produce and that kind of thing, but also bulk foods, which are very competitively priced. We have a lot of sort of more boutique-y products that are for the food connoisseur, exotic oils and spices from remote parts of the world. You might not find them in the grocery store 2 blocks away. But those are not cheap, right? And so I think sometimes we get a reputation for being expensive because people look at a salad oil and say, why is that $13 when I can get, safflower oil for $2.99 over at the grocery store. So I mean, some of the things we vend are actually cheaper. I like to say they're all better, but some of them are, you know, niche boutique products.
Things that you're not going to find elsewhere.
Right.
And some people may walk by and say, well, and they may not necessarily appreciate the distinction in the quality or the difference, and that's where you enter into the issues.
Exactly.
National trends, local trends, regional trends in food cooperatives. What are you seeing there?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was just at a co-op conference a couple of weekends ago in the Twin Cities, organized by North Country Cooperative Foundation, and I saw there's tremendous energy around it still. There were probably half a dozen groups there who were in the startup phase, who were trying to do a capital subscription to get started. One of them in North Minneapolis, one of them up by Aiken, a couple down in Iowa. I think it was Cedar Rapids, Cedar Falls, something like that. So people continue to be interested in this sort of grassroots approach to you know, building the food system out. And that's encouraging to hear. The old war horses who've been at it forever, you know, oscillate between, you know, being optimistic and being, you know, weary of the whole thing. So it's a mixed bag. But the co-op movement is not going anywhere.
Yeah. So based on what they say now about what's going on and based on your own experience, if someone is thinking about this and saying, how would I start a food cooperative in my town? Mm-hmm. Where do they start?
Where do they start? Well, let's see. There's a website called Cooperative Grocer Network. I think it's cooperativegrocer.coop, C-O-O-P. You probably didn't even know that's a
I did not.
suffix.
That's an unusual web. It's like there's actually a .tv as well, but right. We digress. So .coop, yes.
.coop. And they are a tremendous resource for sort of all aspects of it: how to organize the co-op, how to get legally situated, how to construct your member dividend payments, how to do your pricing, how to do your ordering, you know, thoughts about what your end caps should look like, and interior, you know, about how the store should operate, and whether you should have volunteers or paid staff. There's volumes of extremely relevant information on that site. There's also North Country Cooperative Foundation, which I mentioned a minute ago, is the organizer of this co-op in of this conference in the Twin Cities, and they are a association of sort of very well-informed cooperative specialists who hire themselves out for consulting projects, and the knowledge base there is tremendous. So I'm sure they have some startup resources available also. I haven't investigated that.
Well, good advice and a lot of hard work ahead. We know that for anyone who's going to start.
Great.
Okay, great. Arne Kildegard, Pomme de Terre Co-op, thanks for joining us on Compass.
Thank you, Les.
It's a great discussion. That's it for this week on the topic of food co-ops in rural areas. Our Compass producer, Laura K. Prosser, will take it from here, and she'll end this week's episode with the next installment of the Compass Literature Corner. Thanks for watching.